A special task force was created to bore a hole through the Chinese and back to friendly lines. Task Force Faith took only enough trucks to carry the wounded and destroyed all the weapons it couldn't carry. It set out on December 1st. Enemy fire came from all sides. As if this wasn't enough to contend with, friendly napalm fell a little too close for comfort. The two lead companies were shelled by planes flying close air support. The task force came upon a village swarming with communists and was completely blocked. There was no option but to advance directly through the Chinese blockade. 2,500 GIs entered the town. Only 1,000 made it through. Those that could dragged their fallen buddies with them. After 13 days of hell, Task Force Faith finally made it to safe ground. The campaign along the frozen Chosin has become legendary in modern war history. Rarely, if ever, was the cold more blistering, the enemy more unmerciful, or the escape more precarious. And the men who served there are joined forever in a brotherhood known as the Chosen Few. General MacArthur watched from a distance as his forces crumbled in November 1950. Korea would be his final crusade, and a resounding victory there would have assured his immortality. But that victory, imminent just days ago, was slipping away. His frustration was immeasurable, and most of it was directed at the Truman administration. Truman had limited MacArthur's resources to prevent him from attacking China. He imposed airspace restrictions that forbade U.S. fighters from chasing Chinese planes beyond the Korean border, and he limited the amount of manpower and equipment that was sent to the front. MacArthur found these restraints crippling. On November 28th, he sent a message of warning to the Pentagon. "We face an entirely new war. Our present strength of force is not sufficient to meet this undeclared war by the Chinese. This command has done everything humanly possible within its capabilities, but now is faced with conditions beyond its control and its strength. General MacArthur." The relationship between the president and his general, never entirely cooperative, was disintegrating as quickly as the UN's field position. Like its advance 2 months earlier, the UN's retreat gathered momentum as it went. The mass exodus of soldiers was eclipsed only by that of petrified North Korean civilians. Thousands were eager to defect. Their restlessness may have been inspired by UN-sponsored leaflets like these that were airdropped over North Korean villages. The leaflets warned of the dangers of communism and touted the freedom of Western ideals. Disgruntled with their treatment in North Korea, thousands fled south. Meanwhile, the Chinese charge continued. As Christmas approached, UN morale was desperately low. The men resented the limitations being imposed by Washington. Their complaint, which would be echoed 15 years later in another Asian conflict, was that they weren't being allowed to use their superior force to win the war. They, like their general, thought that if they only had better support, they could have spent Christmas in Kalamazoo instead of Korea. To make matters worse, 2 days before Christmas, their field commander, General Walker, was killed in a Jeep accident. The fearless leader who'd once told his troops, "If I ever see you back here, it had better be in a coffin," would go home in one himself. Walker's successor was Matthew B. Ridgway. a proven leader who understood MacArthur's zest for conquest and Washington's wavering enthusiasm. He'd served in both climates. In World War II, he commanded an airborne division over Italy. Later, he served at the Pentagon. His level-headed wisdom brought a vital balance to the battlefield. When he arrived at the front, Ridgway was startled by the somber mood. He wrote to a colleague, "It was clear to me that our troops had lost confidence. I could read it in their eyes, in their walk. I could read it in the faces of their leaders, from sergeants right on up to the top. There was a complete lack of that alertness, that aggressiveness that you find in troops whose spirits are high." General Ridgway. The Chinese onslaught only added to their misery. By New Year's Eve, the Red Army had crossed the 38th parallel and was closing in on Seoul. Ridgway ordered a retreat back to the Han River, except for an arc around Seoul. There, his troops were clinging to the northern fringes of the city. But they couldn't hold out for long. 7 Chinese armies were stampeding straight for Seoul. And once again, the UN was overwhelmed. On January 3rd, Seoul fell for the second time, and by the next day, the UN line had dropped 35 miles south of the capital, well below the Han River. The troops were almost back to square one. In the 4 months since they'd last been here, all they'd gained were casualties. Luckily, breakthroughs in war medicine were keeping many of those casualties alive. What many people think of when the Korean War is mentioned is a wild group of TV characters with names like Hawkeye, BJ, and Hot Lips. But unlike their TV counterparts, the real troops who served in mobile army surgical hospitals, known as MASH units, couldn't leave the set at the end of the day. They witnessed every cruelty war could offer in graphic detail, day in and day out, around the clock. During the war, the men and women of MASH were the backbone of successful field operations. MASH units made their debut in Korea. Each was a complete life-saving system that could operate close to the front lines and shift position at a moment's notice. Never before was war medicine so close to the war.
Here it is 2.5 hours after this man was wounded, and he's lying fairly comfortably now, I would say, in the hospital. How many miles behind the lines is this?
It's about 10 miles. This MASH is right on the 38th parallel.
Right on the 38th parallel.
The surgery's in North Korea, and this where he is now is in South Korea.
Surgery is in North Korea, and the pre-op room is in South Korea.
Each unit was equipped with a helicopter fleet for air rescue, paramedics, and cutting-edge medical technology. But the basic function of a MASH unit was known as meatball surgery. Doctors did whatever they could to keep a soldier stable until he could be airlifted to a full-scale hospital further behind the lines or even offshore. Rescue teams adhered to the golden hour rule. They made sure every wounded soldier was carried from the battlefield to a MASH unit in under 1 hour. The teams relied on road and rail lines where they could. But in the craggy terrain of Korea, airlift by helicopter was usually the best rescue option. The teamwork of helicopter paramedics and MASH doctors saved thousands of lives. Medical teams in Korea saved 25% more wounded than they had in World War II. They became the inspiration for the rescue teams in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf.
Well, now over here we see them starting to carry the patient to the X-ray room. Oh, what's going to happen now?
He's going to X-ray his leg, left leg.
What's your name?
Green, Bobby Green.
Are you a medical corpsman?
I'm a medical technician.
Technician, I see. Will he be back in just a few minutes?
He'll be back as soon as they x-ray him.
Boy, things really happen when they bring a patient into a MASH, don't they?
It takes around 30 minutes to get him in the operating room when we get him.
Between battles, life for MASH doctors occasionally resembled the lives of their TV counterparts. Women served alongside men. Back then, it was the closest they could get to the front lines. Once the front settled down in late 1951, volleyball courts appeared at MASH units. Games helped to pass endless hours of waiting. But when the wounded suddenly flooded in, medics had to be ready for action. Some MASH veterans remember performing surgery for up to 80 straight hours. These doctors would do more operations in 3 days than they had in a year of private practice back home. And the rules of medicine were quite different with casualties of war.
We were concerned only with getting the kid out of here alive, enough for someone else to reconstruct him. Up to a point, we were concerned with fingers, hands, arms, and legs, but sometimes we deliberately sacrificed a leg to save a life. We may lose a leg because if we spend an extra hour trying to save it, another guy would die waiting. Dr. Richard Hooker.
MASH rescue operations were like a well-oiled machine. They were a vital part of keeping UN lines stacked with able-bodied men. After being patched up, the more critical patients boarded another helicopter bound for a permanent hospital. Those less seriously injured went back to the front to fight. With the Chinese attacking that front from all angles, UN forces needed every soldier it could get. By January of 1951, the Chinese had pushed United Nations forces back to the drawing board with a frightening display of manpower. But they were quickly running out of steam. They were overextended and in dire need of supplies. They wouldn't be able to sustain an offensive much longer. Commander Ridgway was confident the days of retreat would soon be over.
I find it difficult to understand the motives of the Chinese communist leaders in continuing their aggression. Surely by now it must be clear to them beyond any shadow of doubt that they are incapable with their own resources of destroying the United Nations forces in Korea or of driving them into the sea, as they continue to boast they will.
The general launched a task force named Operation Wolfhound to investigate the communist weakness. It set out north in the direction of Seoul. The team made it all the way to Suwon, halfway back to the capital, before it found any strong Chinese force. Air Force pilots overhead reported that the enemy was moving north instead of south. The abrupt turnaround was mysterious. Ridgway decided the time was right for a full-scale offensive. He commissioned an operation designed to push the Chinese back to Seoul and beyond. On January 25th, Operation Thunderbolt was unleashed. The troops charged forward and sent the communists scrambling for cover. Within days, they recaptured Incheon and Kimpo airfield, taking both without a struggle. By February, the men found themselves looking triumphantly across the Han at Seoul, as they had 5 months earlier. No one could explain the sudden reversal of fortune, but General Ridgway was determined to do all he could to exploit it. His battle strategy recalled Napoleon's famous command, "Never mind towns, bring me prisoners." Ridgway was more concerned with destroying the Chinese army than with regaining territory. Under his watch, Korea would become a showdown between expendable UN firepower and expendable Chinese manpower. But neither could compete with the wrath of Mother Nature.